Good morning, and thank you all for being with us today in this very special Vototalks. Today we have a very special guest, Adam Grant. I'll introduce him in a minute, and I'm sure this will be a very interesting conversation. Let me first walk you through the dynamics of this Vototalks. I will first introduce Adam, who will then speak for a few minutes. We'll then conduct a Q&A session. I have a few questions of my own that I would love to ask. And then I will take questions from the audience through the chat, and you can submit them as we go here. We'll try and sort through them and ask as many as we can. With that, let me now introduce Adam Grant. Adam is a organizational psychologist at Wharton, where he has been a top-rated professor for several years. Adam, we asked a lot of some of our Wharton alumni whether they had classes with you. They didn't, so I think this is their opportunity to have a master class and ask you questions as well. Adam is a New York Times best-selling author. He's one of TED's most popular speakers. His research has inspired people to rethink their fundamental assumptions about motivation, generosity, and creativity. He's been recognized as one of the world's 10 most influential management thinkers, and in Fortune's 40 Under 40. Adam is also a former magician, which is quite curious, and he was also an All-America springboard diver in high school. Adam's latest book, Think Again, which I'm sure a lot of you have read it, is his best yet. And though I would say that the bar was already very high, as I personally love the originals from a couple of years ago. Today we're going to talk a lot about thinking, or more specifically, rethinking. Attempting to answer questions on how we, change, update our own views, how we change the views of others, and how we create a community of lifelong learners. This is very much in sync with the purpose of the Votorantim Academy as well. So maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later. In organizing this Vototalks, we hope to provoke you to question old assumptions and embrace new ideas and perspectives. With that, let me welcome Adam Grant. Adam, thank you for being with us. Pleasure to have you here with Votorantim.
Thank you, Joao. It's an honor to be here at Vototalks. I will try not to make you rethink any of your enthusiasm from my prior work. We'll see how this goes. So as an organizational psychologist, I've spent a lot of my career as the guy who gets called after 3 consultants have been fired. And at that point, I can't do a lot of harm, but it's a great opportunity to see why people in organizations struggle. One of my first projects was at a major bookstore. I watched the organization go out of business during the digital disruption. I saw similar things happen with the BlackBerry, with video rental stores, with toy stores, and with film companies. And all of these executives thought that the problem was that they were too slow to embrace the digital revolution. But I think there was a deeper challenge at play. These leaders were great at thinking, but they were too slow when it came to rethinking. They fell in love with the way they'd always done things, and they did not question their assumptions, their visions, or their strategies until it was a little bit too late. Now, sticking to your convictions is fine if you live in a stable world, but we live in a rapidly changing world where I think we need the courage and the integrity to admit what we don't know, to recognize when we're wrong, and to pivot before we reach that point where we can't change our minds anymore. So I want to talk today about what it takes to be faster and more accurate with our rethinking. And I know that this is very much in the Brazilian tradition, right? I have watched the game of football be transformed as Leonidas and Pele introduced the bicycle kick and led players all around the world to have to learn to be acrobats. And the question is, how do we bring this into our daily work lives? How do we question the way we've always done things? For me, it starts with your mindset. I've been studying the mental models that make it easier and harder to think again. And I found that you could organize them in a bit of a hierarchy. You probably know some people who think too much like preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. You're in preacher mode. You're trying to proselytize your own views. When you're in prosecutor mode, you're attacking somebody else's views. And if you're in politician mode, you only listen to people if they already agree with your views. It's not hard to see why these mindsets can stop us from rethinking, Because whether you're preaching or prosecuting or politicking, you've already decided that you're right and other people are wrong, which means they might need to think again, but your mental work is done. I was asked recently, is there anything worse than preaching, prosecuting, and politicking? And the only thing I think of was cult leader. Although my wife tells me she actually is always right, so I don't know what to do with that. But my favorite alternative to preaching, prosecuting, and politicking is to think more like a scientist. When I say think like a scientist, I do not mean that you need to own a microscope or buy a telescope. I just mean that you don't let your ideas become your identity. That you're as motivated to look for reasons why you might be wrong as you are to search for reasons why you must be right. There's a growing body of evidence that if we can teach people to think more scientifically, they actually become better decision makers and smarter leaders. I love an experiment done in Milan, for example. Hundreds of startup founders are randomly assigned to either a control group or a scientific thinking group. In the scientific thinking group, they're just taught that their strategy is a theory. When they talk to potential customers, it's a great opportunity to form specific hypotheses. And then when they launch a product or service, they should think about that as an experiment to test their hypotheses. Over the next year, the founders who have been randomly assigned to think like scientists bring in, on average, more than 40 times the revenue of the control group. That's a staggering effect. It's one of the largest I've ever seen as a social scientist. And the major mechanism behind it is they are more than twice as likely to pivot. The poor founders who are not in the scientific thinking group, when their product launch crashes and burns, they still preach that they were right. They prosecute their naysayers for being wrong, and they politic by lobbying board members to support the status quo. Learning to think like a scientist frees the entrepreneurs from that trap. Their product or service bombs, and they say, all right, guess that experiment falsified my hypotheses, and now I need to rethink my vision or my strategy or my market to try to find product market fit. And I think this is so relevant to Votorantim, right? Because whether you're in the realm of metals or orange juice, so many of the skills that you've built up over your career, so many of the past decisions you made were created for a world that doesn't quite exist anymore. And if learning is how you evolve, I think that unlearning and rethinking is how you keep up as the world around you evolves. A big part of thinking like a scientist is listening to the ideas that make you think hard, not just the ones that make you feel good. And I know what some of you are thinking right now. Wait a minute, thinking once is already a lot of work. Are you saying I always have to do it twice? And let me be clear, rethinking does not mean you always change your mind. It just means you're open to reevaluating and reconsidering. And one of the critical steps toward doing that is to change how you manage your network. I was taught when it came to building a professional network that I needed a support network, a group of mentors and sponsors and colleagues who would have my back, who would encourage me and cheerlead for me. But rethinking depends on a different kind of network, a challenge network. Your challenge network is the group of thoughtful critics who you trust to hold up a mirror so you can see your own blind spots more clearly. They are the people who tell you the unpleasant truths instead of the comforting lies. Where do you find these people? Well, there's a dynamic that I've been studying my whole career that I think is relevant here. It's at the very heart of your core value of collaboration. It's the question of, when you interact with people in your network, are they more likely to be givers or takers? You will know the givers as people who are always trying to figure out, what could I do for you? The takers are the opposite. They want to know, well, what could you do for me? It will not surprise you that we are better off surrounded by givers than takers, but we often get tricked about who's who. There's a personality trait that throws us off called agreeableness. You might know agreeable people as warm, friendly, polite, welcoming, Canadian. Disagreeable people as more critical, skeptical, and overrepresented among engineers and lawyers, which is not a joke. That one's an empirical finding. For a long time, I assumed that agreeable people were always going to be givers. Because if you're nice, of course you're going to be helpful. You're going to be a colaborador, right? But then I gathered data from over 30,000 people across industries and countries. And I found a zero correlation between where you stood on that spectrum from agreeable to disagreeable and how far you lean toward giving versus taking at work. What I eventually realized was that disagreeableness is your personality on the surface. How pleasant is it to interact with you? How much harmony do you create? Whereas giving and taking are more of your inner motives. What are your real values and intentions when you deal with other people? So if you want to understand your network, it's helpful to draw the 2x2. And when you do this, of course, this is a gross oversimplification of human nature in all its complexity. But you will probably notice that there are 2 combinations you overlook and 2 that you recognize quickly. Disagreeable takers. I'm guessing you don't waste your time with those people. And you might even call them by a less polite name than I just did. But we get tricked a lot. We get fooled by the agreeable takers, also known as the fakers, who are nice to your face, but then stab you in the back. They're in politician mode. They tell you what you want to hear, but not what they really think. They kiss up and kick down. Watch out. Your support network is probably mostly full of agreeable givers because they say yes to everything. The problem with agreeable people is they don't like conflict. They often are afraid of rocking the boat, which means they hesitate to tell you what to rethink. The most valuable members of your challenge network are the disagreeable givers. These are the people who are gruff and tough on the surface, but they're doing it because they want to help. They have the Votorantim integrity, right, to tell you the critical feedback that you may not want to hear, but you desperately need to hear. They dish out tough love. They have the courage that you look for, right, to tell you those unpleasant truths. I think we need to do a much better job appreciating these people, as opposed to saying, kind of prickly, must be a selfish taker. So one of the things I've done this past year is I've actually reached out to some of the most disagreeable givers in my work life. And I've said, hey, you might not know this, but I consider you a founding member of my challenge network. Then I had to explain what a challenge network was. But I said to all of them, I know I haven't always taken your criticism well. Sometimes I've gotten defensive. Other times I've been too dismissive. And I regret that. I know I need you to push me to think again. So if you ever hesitate because you're afraid of hurting my feelings or hurting our relationship, don't. The only way you can hurt me is not telling me the truth. And I've gotten much better challenges since I had those conversations. What I'm trying to do is create something that is critical to a culture of rethinking. I'm trying to build psychological safety in those relationships. You might know psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson has defined it in her research, as the sense that you can speak up without being afraid of punishment, that you can be candid without having to worry about some kind of backlash or reprisal. We have extensive evidence that when you create that psychological safety, people are more likely to think again themselves, but they're also more likely to tell you what you should rethink. We know in hospitals, for example, when people lack psychological safety, they hide their mistakes, and then everyone's more likely to repeat them. Whereas when they have psychological safety, they can freely admit their errors, study what caused them, and then rethink the routines that would prevent them. We know in tech companies that when people have psychological safety, they let their ideas fly. When they lack it, they bite their tongues. So the big question is, how do you build more of that psychological safety? And I have to tell you, I watch a lot of leaders in a lot of countries and industries screw this up. One of the ways when I catch it is when I hear a leader say, don't bring me blank, bring me blank. Think about a boss you had earlier in your career who loved to say that and fill in the blanks. Don't bring me blank, bring me blank. I'm guessing most of you are thinking, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. I get why leaders say this. You want people to take initiative and be constructive. You don't want them to whine or complain. But I have come to believe this is a dangerous philosophy, because if people can only speak up when they have a solution, you will never hear the biggest problems, which are too complex for any one person to solve. The foundation of building psychological safety is encouraging people to raise problems, even if they don't know how to fix them yet. That empowers the canaries in the coal mine who are good at detecting threats to surface them, even if they lack the expertise or the perceived authority to do something about them. So how do you make that real? One of my favorite steps is something I saw at a pharma company a few years ago. CEO comes in one day and says, look, as a child, I love dinosaurs, but I do not want to run a company full of them. We need to shake things up. Brings in a consultant, Lisa Bodell. And Lisa says, all right, we're going to kill this company. She divides the whole room into small groups, and she says, your job is to put your own company out of business. I'm watching this happen, and I have to tell you, I have never seen a more energized group of executives in my life, right? There was somebody who said, I've been waiting 27 years to destroy this company. Thank you for finally giving me a voice. But after they generated ideas for how to kill the company, they realized some of these are threats, others are opportunities. What are we going to do about them? I love this exercise because people are more creative on offense than defense. If you run save the company, you get a bunch of boring ideas. With kill the company, people drill into all sorts of original possibilities, but also the psychological safety is built in. When your job is to kill the company, there is no problem that's unsafe to voice. So I'd like to see this conversation happen at least twice a year across different regions, across different industries that you're in, because the threats and opportunities are going to change. And it's a great way to prevent this reaction that we often see called solution aversion, where I bring you a suggestion, you don't like it, and you just ignore the problem altogether. If we can talk about ways to kill the company, and as a 100-year-old company, right, this is a great conversation to have because you've survived events that very few organizations have had to deal with. Then we can align on what problems really need rethinking. And it's a lot easier to take the solution seriously. As you look for solutions, one of the big mistakes that I think a lot of us are making, especially since COVID started, is we are only leaning on our strongest ties, our closest colleagues. The evidence shows that our networks are getting more static and more siloed since COVID started, right? We've worked really hard to stay in touch with our core teams, but it's harder and harder to run into those weaker ties, the more distant colleagues, the supply chain people, maybe some of your customers that you don't see every day. And that's a problem because we get more original ideas for thinking and rethinking from our weak ties than our strong ties. Our strong ties give us redundant knowledge. They know a lot of the same things and the same people that we do. Our weaker ties are more likely to open up new ideas. They're more likely to challenge our assumptions. So we need access to those people. One of my favorite ways to open up this access to weak ties is to run an exercise called Give a Toss. I was first introduced to it about 15 years ago. It used to be just an in-person exercise. A couple of years ago, I was brought in to co-found this app to make it an online experience. And all you do in Give a Toss is you invite people to come together and make a request for something they want or need, but can't get on their own. And then you challenge everybody in the group to try to think like givers, to use their knowledge and their networks to fulfill the request. And that's it. Everybody asks, everybody gives. We see some unusual requests. One of the first times this was run, somebody said, my dream is to see a Bengal tiger in the wild. And you're thinking, that's what you asked for? You could ask for anything. Why that? And this guy says, you don't understand. Growing up, I was a tiger for Halloween every year. And I've always wanted to live in a world where tigers roam free. Now, nobody in the group had ever even been to a continent where that was possible. But a few people offered to do quick 5-minute favors and make some introductions. A month later, this guy is flying out to a game preserve to live his lifelong dream of seeing Bengal tigers in the wild. But unfortunately, the tigers got loot. No, just kidding. Never would have happened if he hadn't been able to make that request to a group of weak ties with diverse knowledge and different networks. This happens in a biotech company. Somebody is trying to synthesize a strain of the PCS alkaloid, and they say, it's going to cost me $50,000 US. I can't afford that in my budget. Does anyone know a way to do that cheaper? I don't even know what a PCS alkaloid is, but a complete stranger from a different department of that company says, oh, sounds like a great learning project for my team. We have extra capacity right now. We'll do it for free. Saves the company a big chunk of money right on the spot. So I get to thinking, I want to do this exercise in my classes at Wharton. I want to encourage students to give help, but I also want them to ask for it from people that they wouldn't normally think to reach out to. I want them to rethink who they're comfortable reaching out to for help. And my favorite request came from the student, Alex, who said, I want to work at an amusement park one day. I think roller coasters are nirvana. I want to be part of that, but they don't recruit at the Wharton School. Does anyone know a way to get my foot in the door? And I'm thinking, what are the odds that a bunch of students in their 20s are going to be able to help? A few weeks later, Alex comes into class. I asked for an update. And Alex says, I just got off the phone with the former CEO of Six Flags Amusement Park. I'm like, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened in my classroom. Did you get a job or other leads in the industry? And Alex breaks into this huge grin and says, "You will not believe what happened. I now know I never want to work in that industry." And I was depressed for a little while. But then I realized, having ruled out that dream, Alex could move on to pursue others. And sure enough, he went on to live a different dream as a management consultant who swears to me that one day he will fix the broken amusement park industry. I love this exercise, though, because it motivates the takers to give. It motivates the givers to ask. But it really pushes all of us to rethink where we get ideas and support from. Instead of going to the people that we're comfortable with, that we see every day, it empowers us to reach out to people who might have access to expertise or connections that we never would have even thought of. I think 2020 forced a lot of us to do a lot of rethinking. My hope for 2021 is that we do our rethinking more deliberately and more proactively. There are a lot of decisions probably up ahead that are not ideal for a permanent commitment because we still have so much to learn and there's so much change happening. But now I think is the perfect moment to think more like a scientist, to run more experiments, to invite your challenge network to tell you what to rethink, to point out the big problems, and then enlist some of your weaker ties to help you see solutions you never would have thought of. And I hope all of you at Votorantim and beyond will help me think about how to make rethinking more of a norm. Thank you all. I'm excited for your questions, your comments, and especially Joao, please tell me what I should rethink.
All right, let's try and do that through the questions, Adam. As I said in the beginning, I have a few questions of my own here. I'm gonna just shoot them at you, so we kick this off, and let's make this a conversation. I encourage everyone to pose questions, through the chat, and as I said, we'll go through them here as well and try to do as many as possible. Adam, I want just to get started. I love when you talk in the book about identity. The point being that identity is not about what you believe, it's about what you value. I think you discussed that a lot. Let me ask you, how are you defining the difference between values and opinions, beliefs? It would be great if you could double click on this, and maybe I'll leave you with a follow-up question to that, which is, should we also think about being open to changing our value systems over time? Right? Are they permanent or do they change as well?
So interesting. All right, so let's start with the easy part, which is I would define a belief as something you think is true and a value as what you think is important. And I think a lot of people blur the line between those two. So I think the easiest way to illustrate it is let's take doctors back in the 1950s. There were a lot of doctors who believed that one of the ways you could treat anxiety was to do a frontal lobotomy and remove part of your brain. Turns out that's a horrible thing to do to people. What you want is not the doctor, right, who bases their identity on the belief, because then that doctor is stuck being a professional lobotomist, right? And what I am is what I think is the right treatment. You would want to go to the doctor who forms their identity around their values and said, I am somebody who values, right, who cares about trying to make patients healthy. And then as soon as that doctor sees evidence that lobotomies are dangerous, right, she changes her practice and says, I'm not going to do these anymore. Whereas the doctor who sees herself as the professional lobotomist really can't let that go. So I want people to anchor their sense of who are you, right? Who am I? On what they think is important, not what they think is true, because what's true might change over time. And as new data come in, you want your habits, your behaviors, your practices to evolve. Now, you raised the question, Joao, of whether our values should change. And I think that we should be slower to rethink our values than we are our beliefs and opinions. But I don't think values should be totally closed systems either, right? I think you have an excellent list of values. When I think about courage, integrity, and collaboration, I think it's actually a much clearer set of values. It's a much more focused set of values than I see in most organizations. As you think about the 19 or 20 countries that you're in, as you think about the variety of industries that you operate in, you may discover that there's a fourth value missing at some point, right? And you might say, okay, maybe we should have a conversation about excellence as a value. And maybe, that's implied in courage. But maybe for some people, courage means taking risks and being bold, but not worrying as much about high standards. Maybe you decide you want to add accountability into that mix. And I think as you learn what it takes to succeed in different regions and different industries, as certainly the world around you changes. I think there should be room to rethink that, but I would be a little bit quicker to add a value than I would be to subtract one. And I would be even quicker to rethink your practices and say, okay, maybe it's not the values that need to change. Maybe we need better ways of, motivating people to be courageous, of, encouraging people to maintain integrity, of, trying to foster collaboration. And I think that's where more of the rethinking should happen. But what do you think?
Well, it's interesting because we this new set of values, these 3 words, they have so much meaning to us, and we actually evolved from a longer list, and we also had a list of beliefs, and those were shared by all of our businesses, and then I think by concentrating on integrity, collaboration, and courage, I think we managed to sort of get to the soul of it. And therefore, my question is, it feels to me today that it encompasses most of what we need, and that those 3 words, would allow us to, to expand, with concepts. But then again, as you said, let's see, what the future brings to us. I think, we've done it a few times, and it's been, such an interesting. And when I say a few times, I'm talking about 100 years, right? So it's not a few times in the past couple of years. It's been an interesting experience to do this multi-year project where we reach out, talk to people, and do a checkpoint as to whether we all share these values and whether they're there. So that has been our experience. Yeah. But Adam, let me I have so many questions. But one of the things I love about the book is that you explore early on ideas on how we can get ourselves to be more open-minded and to rethink. We're getting some questions on this as well. For the purposes of this discussion, I wanted to pose a statement to you and see how you react to that. I want to say that we don't like changing our minds. I think you've alluded to that somehow. It feels uncomfortable. It's a lot of hard work. It may just be easier to live our lives as if we, let's say, persistently believe what we believe. Surround ourselves with people that think alike, and help us double down on those beliefs over time. And then again, that is very comfortable, right? Similarly, in the business world, it often seems that having doubts or rethinking, it's an approach that may not get recognized. I mean, while if you assert yourself, then it feels you're in control. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this many times. I think of the many times I did that. One reason you explore in the book is that one of the reasons why we might not be that open, to rethink is because we're overconfident. And you talk about not confusing overconfidence with competence. Do you mind expanding more on that? I think it sounds such an interesting concept to discuss here.
Yeah, I think the mistake that a lot of people make is they assume that expressing doubt or, admitting what you don't know is a sign of weakness. And they think if I project confidence, right, if I show certainty, then I'm going to seem strong. The reality is that if you look at the data, people who express a lot of certainty, they stop others from questioning them, and they also talk themselves into believing what they're saying. And so they're less likely to see what they need to rethink. I think the best check on confidence that I know of is humility. And a lot of people see confidence and humility as opposites. They're not, right? They can actually go hand in hand. So if you go back to the Latin roots of the word humility, it actually translates to from the earth. It's about being grounded. It's about knowing I'm only human, right? I'm fallible. I'm capable of making mistakes. And you can be very confident in your ability to solve a problem while also having the humility to recognize that you don't have all the information that you need to solve it effectively today. And I think that's, frankly, that's been one of the big lessons of COVID is we've watched a lot of leaders who have had to say, I'm actually not sure how we're going to manage this crisis, but I'm confident we have a great team together to figure it out. I think that is something that we need leaders to step up and model. I found in my research that when leaders actually talk about what their weaknesses are, what their areas for development look like, how they're trying to improve, that people don't judge them as any less competent, right? Because they say, wow, this person is secure enough in their strengths to be comfortable disclosing their weaknesses. And then they're also more likely to give feedback and offer those challenges that help leaders grow and change. I think that's a big cultural shift that needs to happen probably in multiple countries and also in many organizations, to say, let's not assume that competence comes from confidence. Let's actually recognize that the people who can admit what they don't know are the ones who have the most secure, the most deep sense of confidence.
Interesting. I have a few questions here from the audience that touch on a similar point, which is there's questions how we should deal with people that do not have the scientist mindset, and then there's people that talk about how do we break the mental models of others. So how do we deal with that, and how do we exercise tolerance of different opinions? So, in the beginning, I said, that what's interesting about the book is you talk about how we change ourselves or how we cause change in other people. I think this is towards the second part of that statement. How do you see that?
Yeah. So let me start with a little story of a project I was working on at a bank, where I was brought in to try to figure out how they could do a better job attracting and retaining junior people. And I spent 2 months there doing experiments, interviews, surveys, observations. I brought in outside evidence as well as internal data. And I gave them a 26 recommendation report on how they could change things. And I was in the middle of presenting it over a video call when one of the senior executives said, well, why don't we just pay them more? And if there was one thing that was not in my report, it was pay, because the bankers were already overpaid. And they've thrown a lot of money at the problem. And if it was going to solve it, it already would have. And I explained this, and the guy said, well, that's not what my experience has shown. And I fired back, yes, that's why I brought you randomized controlled experiments and longitudinal studies, because I wanted to learn systematically from rigorous data, not idiosyncratically from your own personal experience. Did not go over well. And he just kept pushing back. And finally I said, I have never seen a group of smart people act so dumb. Not my proudest moment, not the way that I would like to conduct a respectful disagreement. And I think what I realized was that I came into that conversation, kind of frustrated that he was thinking too much like a preacher of his way and a prosecutor of my way. But when I kept arguing back, I was sounding like a preacher of my way and a prosecutor of his way. And I've had this bad habit my whole career, especially of going into prosecutor mode, where when when I think somebody is wrong, I think it's my responsibility as a social scientist to correct them. And I've been called a logic bully. And when I show up as a prosecutor, it just motivates the other side to bring their own defense attorney to the courtroom. So I'll tell you what I've learned to do differently, which is to think like a scientist. Part of that means that if you don't agree with me, what a fascinating specimen. Like, how interesting is it that somebody could see the world so differently? And that reminds me to be humble and curious, that even if I don't agree with what you think, it means that I can learn something from how you think. And so what I want to do is I want to come into that interaction and say, hey, you know what? I have a bad habit of going into prosecutor mode. And I've even been accused of being a logic bully. I don't want to be that person anymore. So if you catch me doing that, please call me out. And I found that when I do that up front, the other person will call me out and give me the feedback before I make that mistake. But more importantly, they will usually say something up front like, oh, I can be horribly stubborn, and I'm trying to be less that way too. And now we've both come into the conversation committing to being open. The other thing I've found enormously helpful is if somebody is not buying my argument or they're getting resistant or defensive, instead of just arguing back at them, what I want to do is step back and ask, well, what evidence would change your mind? And just asking that question, right, invites some curiosity back into the discussion. It also puts them in a position where they have to explain to me in a logical, fact-driven way, well, here are the data that would shift my opinion. And then I can reason with them on their terms instead of mine. And I don't always remember to do it, Joao, but when I do, just pausing and asking, even just saying, it seems like you're not really buying the data that I'm bringing you. I honestly, I don't even know if you don't find my evidence credible. Why did you hire me? I'd really love to find out. but tell me, is there any data I could bring to the table that would lead you to see this differently? And then I can go back and try to find those data.
Do you personally build on those successes when you feel that you've observed yourself and you rethought the approach and you were successful? I mean, what does that cause you? I mean, does it put you in a positive loop to keep doing it? You know, personally, how does it feel to you?
Yeah, it almost makes it makes this whole process into a kind of an exhilarating challenge, right? To say, okay, can I practice on a daily basis the principles that I've tried to teach through my writing and podcasts? And I think it is, in many cases, it's much easier to talk about it than it is to do it. But that's part of integrity, is walking the talk. And I've increasingly felt like I want to even reverse that and say, I'm not going to talk it until I've really gotten good at walking it. It reminds me, Joe, one of the other approaches that I've found enormously helpful when other people are kind of locked into the preaching, prosecuting, or politicking modes is I want to stop selling altogether. And instead, I want to come in to learn. So one of the ways I would do this, and this works especially well if you're a junior person and you're trying to open the mind of a more senior person, is I might just come in and say, hey, Joao, I've got this idea. I'm really excited about the way it could solve a problem for us or how it could advance our mission, but I know I'm going to face some internal resistance. And I know you're great at making change happen, and people really respect you. And I would love some advice about how I should present this idea so that people really give it a chance. And when I seek your advice, a few things happen. One is that I flatter you, right? We all admire the wisdom of people who come to us for advice. Let's face it, you have great taste. You're a genius. You knew to come to me. And then you also have to take my perspective. And that means you're more likely to be my advocate instead of my adversary. And I'm more likely to learn something from you. And every time I've remembered to do that, to say, well, you know what? If this person is gonna say no to my idea, I might as well start from that assumption and come in and say, how would you get other people to say yes to this idea? And that makes you less likely to get defensive, and it also sets up a dynamic for me to learn from you. Whenever that happens, it becomes for me a reminder that when I'm interacting with somebody, my first and foremost goal is to try to find out what they know and show that I am open to learning. And if I can make that commitment, then they're more likely to reciprocate it.
Interesting. Let me switch topics. When I was preparing for this and I had the chance to speak to some people that have read the books, one of my favorite topics that I mentioned is around what you call process accountability. The topic that in too many places, people are successful if they get results, or they fail if they get bad results. That's simple. But it often takes a long time to really know what the results are, and to be able to judge what the lasting impacts of those results are. Not to mention that maybe one just got lucky or unlucky, with the results. In the book, you talk a lot about this, about the concept of valuing process over outcome, creating, process accountability, by assessing how carefully different opinions are taken into consideration when decisions are made. And you talk about that in the context of an organization that learns, which is quite interesting. Can you share with us, some practical actions on this direction, in this concept of organizations that learn, and the topic of process accountability?
Yeah, I think one of the best examples I've seen is at X, which is the Google Moonshot Factory. So one of the things I hate about American culture, but especially Silicon Valley, is this idea of celebrating failure. Right? I don't know about you. I do not want to throw a party after I failed. Right? I want to crawl into a
Same
hole.
here.
Yeah, it's like, wait, can I hibernate like a bear for the next 3 months, and then hopefully by the end of the winter I'll feel better. I think that what's much more realistic is to normalize failure, and recognize that if your failure rate is 0, it means that you're not aiming high enough and you're not taking enough risks. That you're only going for certain successes, which is a little bit too conservative and cautious to succeed in a world that requires innovation and change. And so what I want to see organizations do, I think the big part of being a learning organization is to have a portfolio of risks, right? Just like if you were to invest in the stock market, you wouldn't put all your money into a bunch of very safe mutual funds. You'd want a diversified portfolio with some higher risk, higher return investments too. I want organizational decisions to work the same way. I think a learning organization has a diverse portfolio, and that means that you hold people accountable for taking intelligent risks, right? For making smart bets along with their safer and more predictable successes. And so the Google X version of this is they bet on some crazy ideas as part of Google's innovation factory. So they said, what if we could send out balloons that powered internet to remote communities? What if we could build a self-driving car? But they also had some ideas that did not work. Like they wanted to turn seawater into fuel. And one of the ways they try to create process accountability and make sure that is a smart risk, an intelligent bet, is they have a rapid evaluation team that comes in and independently assesses, is this a good project? And also identifies kill signals, which are basically reasons to pull the plug. And so in the case of turning seawater into fuel, they said, okay, we need a certain price per gallon. And if we can't reach that as a benchmark in the next year and a half, then that's going to be a signal that this project will not be profitable. And even if you could turn seawater into fuel, it's too expensive and we should probably cut our losses. Once those kill signals are identified, then they actually reward people for pulling the plug as soon as they find one. So if you have the integrity, right, and the courage to say, you know what, this project that I just poured 6 months of my heart and soul into, that was my baby, is not going to work and I'm going to abandon it. They will recognize you. They actually will give you small financial rewards as well to incentivize you to walk away from and abandon a failing project. And that to me is what good process accountability looks like, because people are constantly running lots of little experiments, but they're not getting too attached to them and escalating their commitment. And I'd love to see more of that happen.
Interesting. One of the things we talk about here is that, a single result or, the quality of that result doesn't necessarily represent a good process, but a combination of those results should be able to tell you whether you have a good process to make decisions or not.
Yes. Yeah, that's such a smart way to distinguish luck from actual learning, right? To say, okay, if this is a good process, you should be able to repeat the result.
Yeah. Interesting. Adam, switching topics again, we talked about the book. I could go on talking about your previous books as well. But you've also produced some interesting pieces recently during the pandemic about some concepts that were actually quite useful. I remember when I read your New York Times piece on languishing, and just that sense of now we have a word for this was very interesting. And on the day that piece came out, the WhatsApp here started to messages popping up from everywhere. People say you should read this article. Now we have a word. I've heard you talked about it before. I think you also got messages along those lines. That has been an enormous success by coining, if you will, a concept. How do you see that today? As we move past the most acute phase of the pandemic. So this topic of language, and then can you expand a bit more for us on the concept of flow, which is the opposite of languishing, which is my silver lining to the concept?
Sure. So I think the current state of languishing really varies around the world. I think you're probably in a much better position in Sao Paulo than we are here in Philadelphia, because we're still dealing with an intense Delta wave. I think just in my state alone of Pennsylvania, yesterday we had over 5,000 new COVID cases, which is extremely high for one of 50 states at this point of the pandemic. And I think what happened here, and I've seen this in a bunch of other countries as well, is in June and July, people started to really have a sense of hope and progress and momentum, because it seemed like the worst of the pandemic was behind us. And then the Delta variant came in, and we entered another wave of masking and lockdowns. And all of a sudden, a lot of people were catapulted right back to that state of languishing that was so common in 2020. I think that for those of you who aren't familiar with languishing, It was originally defined by a sociologist, Corey Keyes, about 2 decades ago. And it essentially is the feeling of meh or blah, where you're not burned out because you still have energy. You're not depressed. You still have hope, but you feel a little bit joyless, a little bit aimless. It's kind of like you're looking at your whole life through a foggy windshield. And I think the reason that so many people were languishing as the grief and fear of the early pandemic days faded a little bit is it felt like the world was standing still, like we were all stagnating. And so, we didn't really feel like we could do that much or accomplish that much. I think that the most interesting evidence on how to avoid languishing comes out of some research that was done at the beginning of the pandemic, which showed that there were some people who maintained their pre-pandemic sense of happiness and well-being, even in March and April, in the hardest times of the pandemic. And those were the people who were still able to get into flow. If you're not familiar with flow, it's the state of total absorption in an activity where you're completely immersed and you forget where you are, you forget about all your other worries, you might even forget who you are. I remember one of the deepest experiences of flow I ever had was when I was in college. My sister, who was 11 at the time, said, "You have to read this book." I was like, okay, I'm 19. Do I really want to read a book by, that an 11-year-old loves? And I loved the first Harry Potter book so much that I read the second and the third in one weekend. And I remember finishing the third book and being really disappointed. Not just because it was over and the fourth book hadn't come out yet, but because I suddenly remembered that Hogwarts wasn't real. And I had been so absorbed in the flow of that world that I forgot that platform 9 3/4 did not exist. That is a flow state. And I think the great thing about being in a flow state is when you're in it, you have a sense of mastery, right? You're absorbed in doing something that you're really good at. And that makes you feel like you are making progress, you're moving forward instead of languishing and stagnating. It also puts you in a state of mindfulness. When you're in flow, you are not focused on anything else. And so it's easier to have that sense of concentration that was often missing while we were languishing, where we felt like, I'm in that pandemic fog, I can't focus. And so I think the biggest thing that we can do to get more flow experiences is to crowd out distractions. Joao, you will know, I love the evidence. This was done both in the US and India by Leslie Perlow, where she showed that if you just set quiet time policies, like no interruptions Tuesday, Thursday, Friday before noon, that people become more productive. On average, 2/3 of people have higher than usual productivity. And that comes because they're able to know Tuesday, Thursday, Friday morning, right? I'm going to get into that zone of deep work. I can find some flow. And then I have other time available to collaborate with other people. So I'm really curious. Have you tried like no meeting Wednesdays or no meeting Friday mornings or flexible Fridays, any of that?
I think we have a lot of experiences around Votorantim. I don't think we have the evidence of that as well. We had different experiments. I'll tell you, in my personal case, what I've done over time is I get to the office earlier and earlier because that's when I have that moment to myself when I can read what I want, when I can focus on what I want, and that's my time. And then the day goes on, and you carry on with the different things, and you start interacting with other people. Your routine changes. But I do have a need for that moment where you can concentrate and not get interrupted, and that puts me in a very in a positive state to carry on with the day.
So, Joao, are you saying that if we see you in the office at 5:30 a.m., we should not bother you then?
What I say, if you see me at 7 a.m. and I don't say good morning, I promise to say good morning at 9.
Perfect.
Because at 7, my mind is somewhere else. Anyway, one other point, you've also written recently about another concept, which I also found very interesting in this context of as we try and move post-pandemic. I don't even know what word we use to say the new normal or whatever. It's as we move past this more acute phase. But you articulated recently one of your pieces that emotions are inherently social. And then you use the term, there was, if I remember correct, I think it was collective effervescence. I think the example you used was a concert in New York, if I'm not mistaken, right? Tell us a little bit more about that, because when I read it, I remembered moments I had with people, and I said that's what I felt as well when I was with a bigger group of people, not a concert yet, haven't been to one, but a bigger group of people.
Yeah, collective effervescence originally was coined by the sociologist Durkheim over a century ago, actually right around the founding of Votorantim. And he described it as the energy that you feel when you come together in a group for a shared purpose. So a lot of people would find it when they were praying together at church or when they were dancing together. But one of the interesting things that's come out of new research is one of the reasons that we were missing that collective effervescence as the pandemic was happening was a lot of people felt it riding a bus, just feeling like they had a shared experience with a group of people that they saw regularly, or waiting in line for coffee, right? And having that kind of informal conversation where you feel like you're part of a community and you're living this routine. And, that just disappeared from a lot of our lives for a while. And I think that we're starting to reclaim it now. I think that, in an organizational sense, a lot of collective effervescence comes from having clear goals and clear roles. And I know that, one of the things is, as some people were forced to work remotely and others were, having to mask and social distance when they were coming on site, it was really hard to build interpersonal bonds the same way we used to before. But what a lot of leaders and managers overlooked is even more than those interpersonal connections. Collective effervescence comes from knowing, why are we here and what is my contribution? So goal clarity essentially gives people a chance to fit in, right? To know that, I'm part of something larger than myself. We have a mission that matters and I belong to that. Role clarity is what helps people stand out, to know I make a difference, right? I'm contributing something unique. And so I think one of the ways that we get back to that collective effervescence, even if we're not gathering in big groups, is to be really clear about, what are we up to? Why does our work matter? And what is each person's role to play in it?
How do you link that with the the whole back to the office discussion versus home office, and how we adapt in this new circumstances? I'm sure I'll tell you what our experience has been. We're dealing with there's a lot of people that want to go back right now, while there's a lot of people that just don't want to come back, and the reasons are different. The motivations are fair. We're not talking about undesirable behaviors, and it's just that it's just very different. How do you see that now?
Well, I'm going to do something that I would normally be reluctant to do. I'm going to use a sports analogy at work. Are you ready for this?
Would love it. Yeah.
All right. So normally I worry sometimes that it leaves out half the population. And also it's sometimes just a stretch. Like, when was the last time at work you agreed exactly on how to keep score, and you also hired referees to enforce the rules? But when we think about this question of remote and hybrid work, in my world of organizational psychology, there are 3 types of collaboration, and they map perfectly onto individual sport, relay sport, and team sport. So if your work is mostly an individual sport like gymnastics, you do not necessarily need to come into the office, right? You can let everyone go off and do their own bar, their own beam, their own floor routine, their own vault, and then the whole is going to be roughly the sum of the parts. If you're running a relay race, though, you better make sure the person who's passing the baton is in synchronous communication with the person who's receiving it. And then where I think we really need to be in the same room or the same Zoom is when we're playing a true team sport like football, right? Where I pass you the ball, then it goes to somebody else, then it goes back to you, then it goes to someone else, then it comes to me, then it goes to you again, right? If we need everybody to touch it multiple times, if we need everyone's knowledge and skill throughout the collaboration, then we have to make sure that we don't just have regular meetings, but we're really blocking out work time to solve problems together. And I don't think we're having enough of this discussion, right? To say, okay, before we determine how much we're back in the office, let's ask, what are we doing right now? Are we playing gymnastics? Are we running a relay race? Or are we playing football?
Yeah, what I always frequently have been mentioning here is that you have to be where the action is. It's not the place that defines you; it's you that define the place. So that is something that we've been talking about here. Not easy though. We've been running lots of experiments, but we'll see. I think the evidence is still out there for us.
Well, it reminds me a little bit. I know one of the biggest challenges is, as people are more distributed, is keeping culture alive.
Yeah.
And I think one of the dynamics that's really powerful right now is to think about who are your culture carriers at Votorantim. So who are the people who shape everyone else's sense of what it means to live your values? And what I've found in a lot of organizations is that senior leaders often don't know who the culture carriers are at lower levels because you couldn't be in all those rooms. And I love to find them. So one of the things I would be thrilled to ask is, if I could only meet one person at your company, and after 10 minutes of watching them or talking to them, I would get what's special about your culture. Who is that person? And if I ask a bunch of leaders and a bunch of managers that question, I will start to hear some of the same names. And then I want to make sure that those culture carriers are visible during recruiting and onboarding, that they're leading team meetings, that they speak at your all hands, because they're the people who really show us what it means to have integrity and courage and to collaborate effectively. And I wonder, have you done anything yet with culture carriers? Is that an opportunity in front of you right now?
I think it is. I mean, we've had this concept in recruiting of the we call them the ambassadors. So the people that go out and talk about us. I think if we run a poll here, some of these ambassadors would fall in the cultural carrier category as well. So that'll be an interesting one. Maybe we do it. Maybe good concept. Leave it with us. Follow-up work.
It's all yours.
Yeah. Adam, as we, we're getting close to the end here. There's maybe I'll ask you some additional questions you have here from the chat, and then I have one of my own to ask you to finish it. Some people are asking in the chat whether there's a sort of an evolution, a timeline as you go through the preacher, prosecutor, politician into scientific mindset. Is that, do you go through stages on that, or is that just not the case? And then there's other people asking if you think that people with the scientific mindset will live more meaningful lives as a result of the quality of the connections that they make by having this approach.
Fascinating. There actually hasn't been good research yet on the cycling through preaching, prosecuting, and politicking. It was originally defined in a paper by my colleague Phil Tetlock, and then recently I created a survey to gauge how often people are in these mindsets, and found that if you're in scientist mode, you're actually better at predicting the future in a forecasting tournament that we ran this year. What I think my hunch is that many people have a default mode, which is related to their personality and also their values. So I think that in general, preachers tend to be people who are optimistic and extroverted. Prosecutors tend to be a little bit more disagreeable and maybe a little bit more conscientious, always looking to correct and fix things. I think that politicians tend to be, in many cases, highly agreeable and also fairly open-minded when it comes to what they have to say. And my guess is that that we have different combinations of how often we go into these modes, depending how often we're in a position to spread our values versus we're attacked and we feel we have to defend, versus we're trying to please other people. What are the rewards of being a scientist? I'm not sure that scientific thinking always makes people happier. I think sometimes it makes you aware of how wrong you are, which is annoying, right? But the faster you are to recognize when you're wrong, the faster you can move toward getting it right, which is the goal. I think that it makes it easier to cope with those moments of being wrong, because instead of seeing that as a threat to your ego, when you're thinking like a scientist, you say, I learned something and I'm now less dumb than I was yesterday, which can be, a little bit of a relief. I think where the rewards of thinking like a scientist really come is whether it makes you happier or not, whether it leads to a more meaningful life. I think it leads to a richer life, a more interesting life, because you run more experiments, you get to explore more ideas, and that creates more variety of experience. And I think that's probably something worth having in and of itself.
Interesting. So we're approaching the end. I have a final question to ask you. I wanted to ask whether you could share with us maybe one change story, or one think again story. As I imagine that people may reach out to you when they read the book and they go through their own experiences. I'm sure they share some of that with you. So maybe one final best story on think again that happened to someone that shared it with you.
Oh, my favorite one recently was from somebody I haven't seen in over a decade. He took a 2-hour mini class that I taught, and he emailed me out of the blue one day and said, I read Think Again, and I was talking to somebody who I had just met about the decision about whether to get vaccinated or not. And I was really tempted to preach about all the reasons why it was a good idea and to prosecute him for being resistant. But then I remembered what you wrote in chapter 7 about how you're better off thinking like a scientist and interviewing the person to say, I can't tell him what to believe, but I can help him find his own motivations to change. And so he just asked this guy, what are your hesitations? What are the reasons why you would consider it? And what would convince you to do it? And the guy ended up talking himself into getting vaccinated that day. And I thought that was an exciting moment, not just because I think that vaccines are probably going to help us get out of the pandemic, but also because it was a great moment to see somebody in real time actually change his own way of opening someone else's mind. And I would love to see more people benefit from the ideas that practically.
Very interesting. That is very inspiring. Adam, we've reached our time. You've been very generous to be here with us today. This was certainly very inspiring. Very nice conversation. Great to meet you. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us at Votorantim. We also have guests today with us that are not from Votorantim. We invited the general public. So thank you very much for taking the time. Hope to see you maybe someday in person here in Brazil.
Same. Thank you for having me. And I'll just say, if I were to add a fourth value, the one that you exude is curiosity. It seems like you read everything and you're always excited to learn. And I want more of that in every organization that I work with. So thank you for modeling that.
All right. Good. That's a good one. I love it. Yeah. All right. So thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining Vototalks. I wanted to thank the team from Academia Votorantim for putting this together as well. And everyone who contributed to this from the companies, from the holding. It's been a very interesting conversation. A lot for us to chew on. Have a good day, everyone.